Nadine Jacobson Weinstein received her bachelor's degree in education with a minor in psychology from Towson State College in 1963. Mrs. Weinstein taught for 1 year before starting a family. She also taught adults for several years and served as a substitute teacher. Much of her professional career was spent as a fundraiser for several organizations and institutions. These are her reflections.
Mrs. Weinstein, thank you so much for joining us this morning to tell us a little bit about your life and your preparation at Towson and your subsequent career. I think this will add greatly to our understanding of teacher education at Towson University across time. I guess the first place to begin is in the beginning. So would you share with us a little bit about your early social context, where you grew up, what you were thinking about as you went through school, what kinds of career aspirations you had?
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this. I can tell you that as a young child and growing up, which was in Northwest Baltimore, my goal was always to be a teacher. I had a blackboard that I used for my dolls, and I was always teaching them. In the summertime, that was my main occupation, was pretending to be a teacher. There was something about it and I loved school. I had wonderful teachers. I had gone to an accelerated junior high school that was in the city at the time. And it was just something that I always wanted to do. So I got to Towson, which was extremely attractive at that point because if you promised to teach, there was basically no tuition. So that was something that my family could afford.
Yes.
And I was a commuter. I think some of my friends and I were not typical commuters in that we did not strictly go to class and go home. We would stay for activities. We got friendly with some of the people who lived in the dorms.
Yes.
So it was a little bit more of an experience than just like high school, going to school and going home. Well, didn't do that necessarily either, but it was a little different. And obviously I came as a freshman and then left in the middle of my junior year when I got married, took a leave of absence and took some classes out of state where I was with the goal that I wanted to graduate with my class.
That's interesting.
When my husband's Army experience was not as drastic as we had thought, and we came back to Baltimore the following fall, I did my student teaching and was taking additional classes at night someplace else with the goal that I was going to finish in time. Which didn't quite happen. I was one class short.
Oh, no.
In June. So the school said that I could be, quote, part of my class, but I could not participate in graduation. So I said, okay. And through my student teaching experience, I had a job for the following fall.
Wonderful.
So that worked out it was very interesting because the woman who was the head of the department that oversaw student teaching had told me that I had been offered a job in the city, and it was a school that she was involved in.
Oh.
And the school where I had two student teaching experiences. One was in the city, in the school that I had attended kindergarten through 6th grade, in the first grade room next to mine, with a teacher who had been there when I was a child. So it was fascinating. And my second experience was in the county, and that principal offered me a job.
I see. And what school was that?
That was Wellwood in Baltimore County.
And what grade?
First grade.
Nadine, can we go back a little bit
Yes.
about and have you talk a little bit more about your experience at Towson? Not only, your liberal arts, your coursework, and your courses related to education.
Well, at that point, which was 50 years ago, we really didn't have a whole lot of flexibility in terms of elective courses because everybody was an education major.
Right.
So you did have the opportunity to do some concentration of others. Mine was psychology, which I absolutely loved. I had mostly phenomenal professors, and it just fascinated me. I loved it. The education classes were kind of a mixture, where at that point there was something called new math, where instead of a base of 10 or 12, you could use anything.
I see.
It was an exercise in futility that didn't last very long. But it was one of the courses that I remember the best because it was very different. And kind of interesting, but clearly not something that was going to be very applicable to what I wanted to do.
Right.
The classes where we had participation in our junior year in schools, where I was in some kindergarten classes, I dearly loved.
And this was before student teaching.
This was before student teaching.
You actually got to go into
Yes.
schools before.
Right. We did. We went like once a week, and I don't remember if it was the whole semester or not. And we were supervised. You know, of course, the teacher was there, but they did let you do some activities and work with the children, and it was a wonderful exposure.
Yes.
It was, you know, because you really were hands-on, and you saw how the school worked and all the things that went with it. I don't think they ever prepare you enough for paperwork and stuff. And it was, the setup in schools then was very different than it is now also. Because there was a lot of things that were done on teacher time, you know, in your own time.
Right.
The kids didn't have a day off because the teachers were going to do report cards or have conferences. That was done
In addition to.
But the courses, by and large, I would have to say, I think prepared us very well. Obviously, student teaching is the most critical piece, because that's when you really see what it's about. I had very good supervising teachers, and I think that that's where you really get your sense of what you're getting into.
Exactly. And you said you had two experiences. One was in the city.
One was in the city in a first grade, and one was in the county in the second grade.
And how long did you stay? Was that half a semester in one?
Yes, because we were there, we were student teaching the entire semester. Mine was September to February. You could do it first or second half of the year. And mine was the first, which actually I think was a little bit longer.
Who knows?
Maybe a week or so, just because of the way the time fell.
Right.
So it was half a semester in each one.
And
that
did
was
you
nice.
get to what extent did you actually get to work with the kids and teach kids?
Oh, tremendously. I mean, when you came in, the supervising teacher, introduced you. You had an opportunity to spend a little time with her to see what she did and how she did things. And then you were expected to start making lesson plans and teaching lessons. And you'd maybe teach one subject and then another. And it would get to the point after a couple of weeks where she would just leave the room and planned.
Of course.
And you were, quote, the teacher. So that you really had a lot of hands-on experience and, handling whatever came up, obviously spontaneously, because kids are very spontaneous.
They certainly are unpredictable.
And you had the exposure to the special teachers and, teacher relationships. You were part of the faculty room atmosphere.
Did you interact
with parents?
I was just going to ask.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's funny because there are some parents that I still see, I'll bump into, whose children were in those, well, especially the city class, where we just have this tremendously warm connection. And every time I see this mother, she's updating me on my Marcy, because you really do get very attached. I mean, I remember those kids like it was yesterday. And of course now they're very grown, and
Have kids of their own.
some of them have grandchildren.
Well, oh, okay.
So it was a very special experience, I think.
And then you did, the second experience was in the county,
Yes,
and that was second grade.
right. And it's funny because one of the high-low lights of that experience was when I was offered a job by the principal for the
Ooh.
next year,
Uh-huh.
and I was very excited because I had tremendous affection and respect for this man.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was being scrutinized a little more by the vice principal.
I see.
And she came in and she said to me, "You will have to learn to write on the board with your right hand." I'm left-handed. And I
Really?
was horrified because at that point I couldn't imagine that I could do anything except pick up something with my right hand.
Right.
And I went to the principal and I said that she had told me that, and he laughed. And he said, "You will not, and I will speak to her. However, they did that to her when she was in college. She was left-handed, and they made her learn to write, and she was miserable." And he said, "She's been waiting for years to do that to somebody else. And she's
And
not
there
going to do
you
it to
were.
you." Yeah, and I said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." So I did not have to do that. But it was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful group of people. And it was in that classroom the following year. Well, not that particular class. My classroom was next door to the one where I student taught, and that's where I was when President Kennedy was killed. So it is.
And that's your first fall as a teacher.
Yeah, and so that is, when people talk about
Where were you?
where were you, and they did not announce that in the lower grades. They were afraid the children would be confused and upset. So somebody came into the room, and called me over, and it was like, oh my, So it was an interesting time. It really was. But I really felt like my preparation at Towson prepared me to do a pretty good job. I think that there's nothing like being there
Exactly.
and doing it, and you do learn a lot also from the people you work with. And I was lucky. I had a very experienced and welcoming group of first grade teachers
Very nice.
to go into, which was very helpful. But I do feel like we went very prepared.
And did you feel that way at the time when that job came up? Were you fairly confident that I'm
Yes.
ready, I can do this?
Yes, I think so. I mean, some of that is youthful stupidity. Because the younger
Of
you are, the
course.
more you think you can do and know and whatever. And then you get older and go, oh, I don't really know very much at all. But I do. I think that all the things that we had to do with the practical things were good preparation
Yes.
for what was to come. And, there's some things that you just pick up along the way. And every school is different. Every administration is different.
Yes.
But I really did feel like it was very helpful. And I always had very warm feelings. And as things grew, and I would periodically come back and watch this, I remember thinking, it's not the same.
No.
I mean, when I was walking up here today,
Yes.
and I said to this gentleman who helped me find my way, I said, it was much easier 50 years ago. There was one classroom building when we first got here. Then another one, the original Lyda Lee Tall, became Van Bachlen Hall.
Right.
And they had built this new Lyda Lee Tall down the way. We were talking about something that was so self-contained and so
Yes.
easy. And because of that, very close.
Of course. And everybody had the same major.
They did. They did. And there was just a certain camaraderie that was, it was easy. It was easy to fit in. It was easy to meet new people. It was a very comfortable atmosphere. And it was very interesting. The end of my freshman year, I broke my finger playing softball in school, and on my left hand. And being left-handed, I was really concerned about it. It was like finals week. And most of the professors were just wonderful. One mate said you can have somebody you can dictate to, and one said we'll do it orally. And people made all kinds of arrangements except the English professor.
Oops.
And of course, that was the most writing. And she said, you will write this exam.
Really?
There is no way that she could have read anything I wrote with my right hand. I mean, but
you passed the course.
I did pass the course, but I did not leave with wonderful thoughts of her. She did not go down in history as my favorite professor.
I can understand why.
So, but you know, you know, just the atmosphere, the fact that most people were accommodating,
Yes.
you know, said a lot. And most of the professors were very accessible. It was just a very nurturing place to be. And it's funny, I couldn't imagine at that point being someplace where there were hundreds of people in a class and all of that kind of thing, because that wasn't my experience, and I was
Right.
happy.
So here we have you. You're in your student teaching school, but you're teaching first grade.
Right.
And how did that first year go? Of course, we had the unfortunate
We
Kennedy.
It went very well. I loved it. I had this adorable group of kids, and it was a wide range. At that point, that school was grouped very heterogeneously. I had what were the youngest children. So they were supposed to be, quote, the slowest because they were the youngest. And of course, that was not the case. I had 3 very distinct groups of kids in that class.
Interesting.
I had one group that was very bright, to the point where a few months into the year, I went to the principal and asked if one little girl could go to 2nd grade for reading. Because she was immature and she couldn't sit still, but she could read like lightning. And she understood everything she was reading. And I didn't think it was fair. So there were several kids in that class that were like that. And then there was this group of nice, solid, average, happy kids. And then there was a small group of kids who were not doing as well and really required, one of whom wound up being held back. And that was very instructive. You know, it's not the kind of thing that's easy to do, and the family was not happy.
Right.
And there were all kinds of attendant things to that. And that was my only year.
Interesting. That was a brief career.
It was very brief, but at the end, and it was interesting because I was concerned about telling the principal that I was pregnant. And the day before I was going to tell him, there was an article in the paper about principals who were being transferred. And he was one of them. And I breathed a sigh of relief, and I went in and I said, I was dreading this, but we're leaving together. So he left. And I probably would have come back, except that I couldn't start the next year because at that point you could not teach if you were beyond a certain point in your pregnancy.
I see.
So I said, well, if I have to stop, I have to stop.
Yes.
I might as well just stop, because I couldn't go back in September, and then I was going to have a baby, and then the year would be half over, and it was like, okay, that's it. What I did do, however, and I can't remember if I did it after the first baby.
So when was your first child born?
He was born the year after.
Right. So this just would not have worked, as you said, to go back.
Right.
You couldn't have done that anyway.
Right. So it was, it was like the following fall. So there I was. But there was a school built very close to our house a couple of years later. And I did go there and substitute a lot. For many, many years. All the years that I had kids there, which was a lot of years.
And how many children did you have?
3. 3 wonderful sons who have given us 3 wonderful daughters and 8 wonderful grandchildren.
Very nice.
So, and it's very interesting because that has carried over. The oldest children are in a wonderful school in the city.
Uh-huh.
And from the time they started there, I was going there to help with things and whatever. And I realized how much I loved being in an elementary school.
Yes.
It was wonderful.
And this is with your
This
grandchildren.
is with grandchildren. So in between, I had done a lot of substituting in my kids' school, and then I went back to work part-time, just looking for something
Of course.
to do, and wound up doing something administrative in a CPA firm. And then started teaching adult ed
Ah, well, that's
for the county.
a big change.
It was a very big change, and I remember thinking the first semester that I did that, the difference with adults, because they really wanted to be there.
Yes.
And I had basic education, I had ESOL classes, and I had GED classes. So the basic classes were really almost like being back in my first grade classroom,
Uh-huh.
because these were people who really needed basic skills.
Yes.
Regardless of that. I mean, there was one gentleman that came to me and said, "Can I speak to you after class?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, and this was a man with a successful business,
Yes.
and he said to me, "You're now the second person, my wife is the only one to know I cannot read."
Wow.
And
I mean, that takes a lot of courage.
well, it did, and he had reached a point where he was having grandchildren, and he wanted to be able to read to them. And I said, "How did you manage?" He said, "Oh, he was good with his hands, and he could do," and I don't know what the business was, I don't remember. But employees would come in with ideas to him, and they'd say, "I'll leave this proposal." And he'd say, "Oh, well, I'm busy. If you read it to me while I'm doing what I'm doing, then I can give you a quick answer, and we can," and he said that he faked it all these years.
Wow.
And he wanted to be able to read.
Mm-hmm.
And so those skills went back to my undergraduate courses
Absolutely.
in teaching reading and phonics and all the things that really worked. Basic math, basic reading. And it was amazing. There was one young man in one of the classes who said to me, I sat in this same classroom and graduated from this same, it was a high school,
Really?
a few years ago. He said, but I really don't feel like I can read well enough to go on. So there was a tremendous range.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it did require the same skills
Sure.
and knowledge. So,
Well, you were still a teacher.
yeah, and so I really enjoyed that. And then it kind of branched out into other things, and I kept thinking, I don't want to be tied down. I'm ready to go back to work.
Yes.
I don't want to be tied down to a school year schedule, I don't think.
Mm.
So I went to a counseling service in the community
Yes.
and took this battery of tests.
Uh-huh.
And they came back and they said to me, you should do fundraising.
Okay.
And I said, you must be crazy. I hate asking people for money. Well, you need to re-examine this.
Did you have a skill set? I don't know, but some.
Well, I mean, I had done
what did they?
volunteer work, and I had done, some charity work.
Yes.
And, it was one of those things like any other kind of testing that we took
Sure.
at the time, where they ask you a series of questions
Uh-huh.
and they come up with these things.
Uh-huh.
And around that same time, and I'm not sure exactly the
Sure.
time frame, but around that same time, I had been involved. My husband is part of an organization called the Oriole Advocates, which is a group of volunteers that, if you go to a ball game and somebody's handing out giveaways,
Uh-huh.
that's them. Sometimes I'm there doing it too. And there was a big event going on, and I had said that I would help them.
I see.
And we were doing this with the Oriole Wives, and it was a fun kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
And I met a couple of people, and they were doing some of the work for the Johns Hopkins Children's Center. And through this whole event working and all of the people that were involved, the doctor who was then the head of the Children's Center said, I will create a temporary position if you will come into the development office.
Wow.
And I said, okay.
Well, he recognized clearly that you had some skill associated with fundraising.
Well, it was just very interesting to me. And as time went by, I was thinking, most people end their careers at Hopkins. It's not a place where most people start. But that did turn into, I guess, a 20-year career that I did not stay at Hopkins, but that was how it evolved into fundraising management and, and that was what happened. And of course, then it was interesting to me because I still felt like there were skills that I had learned in college
Yes.
that were applicable there.
Mm.
And one of the last positions I had was with an agency that provided tutoring services for adults and children who were dyslexic.
Oh.
And obviously that called again into play a lot of those skills, and there were a lot of things that went on because we were teaching.
Yes.
And even though I wasn't doing the hands-on, I was still involved in that. And we were doing training for these volunteer tutors. So there were a lot of things that came into that. Interestingly, there were two people that came in, one who came in as a student and one who brought her child as a student. Both of these young women were people that I had taught as children. And it was very interesting. And the one said to me, did you know? And I said, I did not know you were dyslexic, but I knew there was a problem. So it was just very interesting. It was almost like coming full circle.
Yes.
And of course, 50 years ago, the knowledge of specific learning disabilities was
not there.
Well, and a lot of these kids got slotted.
Sure.
And there were there were people in that class, in those different groups that I had.
Yes.
Where it was obvious. I mean, there were a couple of them that I can remember, and I can see their faces in front of me, where the phonics just didn't work. And I was and I still am a big believer in phonics. But occasionally there will be students where they cannot learn that way. And I remember working with these two boys differently, taking extra time. In fact, it was interesting because one of their mothers gave me what I thought was the ultimate compliment. She came to me crying and she said, please, won't you move up to second grade next year and have him again? And I said, actually, I'm moving out. But, and I said, I couldn't do that. But it was interesting. And of course, all of that came back, as I thought about that years later and became more aware of the symptoms of dyslexia and other learning differences and the kinds of things that were available. And so that has continued to be an interest.
Yes.
Because of the experience. And I think that having these two young ladies come back into my life at that point was a big influence on that too. Because I thought, okay, this...
But the length of influence, that all these years later, I wonder if all teachers are that aware of the degree of influence on a child's life.
Well, and I think that was one of the things that made the biggest impression on me, because I remember so many of these kids, and the fact that some of them would remember me. And there have been incidental reunions of people, and where somebody said, I remember that you, whatever. And you're thinking, you really don't have any idea. Although I should have, not to flatter myself, but just from the fact that I remember my teachers so well.
Yes.
Especially the elementary school ones. I mean, I can picture in front of me every one of them. I can tell you their names.
Wow.
And, you know, things about them that were, some of the ones that were so strict and scary, but were really good teachers. Some of the ones who were so sweet and nurturing, like the very early ones. I mean, I remember my first day of kindergarten.
Really?
Like it was yesterday. I can remember walking in that, and the school is still doing pretty well. I remember walking into that door, and this wonderful, wonderful lady. So school had a big impression, you know, for all through the years, I guess. And I guess that's why I love going back with the grandkids and seeing what's going on and seeing them having, in fact, my daughter-in-law and I were talking about that yesterday when I went to her son's kindergarten Shining Star Award Assembly. And she had tried to get both of her kids into another county school that was closer to where she works. And she said to me, "Remember when I was trying to do that?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I'm so glad that they didn't let me do it." She said, "This has been so good." And I agreed with her. The kids have had wonderful teachers. Both my city and county school children have had a fabulous exposure. I say both schools look like the United Nations. And it's fabulous. They have friends from all different cultures, and they don't even think about it.
No.
And I think it's fabulous. I really do. They've had good teachers, they're meeting good people, and it's a wonderful exposure. So I love it. And I love going back and just being there and sitting there and watching what's going on and going, "Oh, I like the way she does that. I used to do things like that. Or, I never thought of that," or whatever it is. It's very rewarding. And I think that, I don't think that teaching ever completely leaves you.
No.
If it's something that you enjoy. And it was just purely circumstances that all of these things evolved the way they did, and that I took a different path, but I still felt like the skills and the background were an influence. And I did a lot of public speaking in some of these nonprofit management positions. And I felt like that also was connected to the teaching background, some of the courses that I took, because I had taken a couple of speech classes. And I felt like that was really helpful with that. So I think that there are things that you apply. You know, you take certain courses and think, "I'm never ever going to use this."
Right.
And I've come to the conclusion that that's probably not very true of even geometry, which I thought nothing.
Yes.
You know, there's no relationship.
Right.
But there are pieces of that I remember. And that I think there's something about the process.
Yes.
That does help you in planning, thinking things through, whatever. And I think you do that in anything you do.
Are there other positions that you had when you were in fundraising, that kind of position that you would like to share with us?
Well, I think other than the dyslexia organization, one of the most impressive for me was there was a foundation that was started by the doctor who was the head of the burn unit over at what is now Hopkins Bayview. And the years that I spent there working with patients and survivors and the medical team and some of the people, there was an annual conference, and so I met other people from other places doing similar kinds of things, or just there were a lot of firefighters that were involved. And the exposure to some really horrendous situations, and some, again, it's very interesting to me that there are very few things that you can do or places you can go where there's not going to be a connection to your life.
Yes.
And where people, I remember that when I took the tour when I was applying for that position, and the doctor took me through the burn unit, and I was a little apprehensive when
Of
he
course.
said, would you like a tour, because I thought I didn't want to faint or embarrass these
Right.
patients. And he said some of them look pretty awful. But I felt like that was important if I couldn't do that. And I found that I got so caught up in the stories. And there were a couple of people there who were clearly people who had done drugs and were, in a vacant house and set something on fire, and that's how they got burned.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me and he said, some of our patients are not very good citizens. But everybody gets the same care.
Yes.
And that was true. But there were also people there. There was somebody we knew whose father died in that unit.
Mm.
Someone we knew whose son died in that unit. So there are a lot of things. My children don't tease me anymore, but for many years they did. When I said to them, when you're finished with the toaster oven, unplug it. If you go into my house now, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that isn't connected either to a surge protector or that all small appliances are unplugged. Because I have seen
Mm-hmm.
that electricity from a storm can come through a wire and set your house on fire, and you have literally seconds to get out of there
Mhm.
to survive. I have seen people who were driving and didn't have enough space between the car and the truck that exploded. A young lady who was a model
Mm.
who basically lost her face and went through hell.
I'm sure.
Saw people with the amount of plastic surgery that was needed for reconstruction and never really completely get back. But
No.
they do make tremendous strides. But that was probably one of the most impressive
Mm-hmm.
things. And there are things from that I still, whenever I hear somebody, and they've changed the burn unit. The children used to be a part of that unit. Now
Mhm.
they go to the Hopkins main campus.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you never really stop learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are always related things. I wrote all the materials for these positions so that there would be brochures and packets of information to hand out. And which I still have from each position because it took a lot, to write something that was going to be published and to be...
Distributed to a wide audience.
Well, it was. And you learn that you have to be concise and that you have to be, there are just a lot of things that are humanly related
Mm-hmm.
that you piece together, and some of that will go back to your English skills
Mm-hmm.
that go back to classes.
Mm-hmm.
The grammar, the phrasing, the
Right.
language. A lot of that harks back to what you start pulling out
Absolutely.
from what you learned in those basic,
Uh-huh.
first couple of years before you were really taking education classes, when you
Uh-huh.
were taking basic things, English and history, and you do need to know those things.
Absolutely.
So,
Now, one of the things you shared with me was the fact that you have sat where I'm sitting.
right.
Could you tell me about that project?
It was very interesting. The Baltimore Jewish Council,
Uh-huh.
which is an associated, part of the Jewish Federation of Organizations, started a project, I think it was 1989. They actually didn't start it. They piggybacked on a program that had been started at Yale University.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people that was volunteering in that Yale project, who was living in Connecticut, was someone from Baltimore.
Mm.
And when the Baltimore Hebrew College, was then called Hebrew College,
Mhm.
which is now part of Towson
It
University,
is indeed.
heard about this and found that they had this connection in Connecticut, they asked these people to come down to train people because there are tremendous, or were then, and still are some, tremendous amount of Holocaust survivors in the Baltimore area.
Mm-hmm.
And these people came down and they trained, they put out a press release about this project. And there were a lot of us that signed up, and they came down and they trained us to do these interviews. They were all videotapes of people who had survived in many different ways. Everybody thinks of concentration camps. Some people hid in the woods. Some people hid any place. There were people who were not in camps but were in hiding, people who did all kinds of things to survive. And then just by accident, after I had started doing this, I met someone when I was working over at the Burn Center. She was a volunteer, and we just happened to have lunch one day, and she started talking about her father, who had been a doctor. She was from Greece, and all these Jewish people he had saved. And I said, don't tell me another thing. Are you willing to do this on a videotape? And she said yes. And then there was a gentleman who had built some furniture for me, and he was from Germany. And he was talking one day when he delivered some furniture about his experiences because he had escaped, got to the United States, went into the Army, and became basically a spy. I said, okay, well, you do. So it wound up just from a lot of things that I had an exposure to people who were liberators and had all kinds of connections to what had gone on. And so a lot of them were also videotaped. And it is unbelievable when you hear people's stories. One couple that I interviewed, and of course my job sitting where you are is basically what you're doing, was giving them a few little words to encourage them and asking them to tell their story.
Right.
And trying not to say too much. Except at key points where it seemed like something was needed. And most of these people had never told their story before. Their children didn't know.
Really?
A lot of them just wanted to forget about it. Sometimes their wives didn't know. The very first interview I did was with a gentleman who happened and I didn't know him at the time, but he lived down the street from me. His wife was American born. She had never heard the story. And what the council did was these people could each bring one person with them for the videotaping if they wanted.
Yes.
And they got a copy of the tape, and the Hebrew University kept a copy so that people could go in and see these. The impetus really was that people were getting older.
Of course.
And that the opportunity to do interviews with people who had actually experienced this was going to be limited. And I interviewed people there was one lady, who was a lovely lady, who was much softer in her feelings about Germans and Poles. And the one question I specifically did ask her was, do you think that you feel this way because you were older when you had this experience? And she said yes. She said she had had a normal childhood, she had gotten married, she'd had a family.
I see.
She was in her early 40s when they had to leave and her life fell apart. And she did make it to the States, and she did resume a life. And she said, I think because of that, I am more willing to recognize that all Germans weren't bad, all Poles weren't bad, but there were people who were, like this gentleman who was my first interview. He was a teenager. And one of the most interesting things with him was he said to me at one point, and at this point they told me that tomorrow I was leaving Auschwitz, and I didn't want to leave. And that was my first reaction. I thought, how could anybody not want to leave? And then I had this quick epiphany that said, I'm saying this with many years
Of course.
history to look at. He was living it. And I said, was it because it was familiar And his words were, and I'm pretty sure it's an accurate quote, "Yes, I knew what this hell was like, and I didn't know what to expect somewhere else." And when he talked about his experience and one of the reasons that he survived, it was just, and my husband went with me. This gentleman and I did several Holocaust Memorial Day programs together over the years. And the first one we did, my husband went with me as part of the audience. They did this sometimes in people's homes. We did them in churches, all over the place. And my husband was so impressed with this one incident where this gentleman explained how he had survived. He had developed an infection in his arm, and he was afraid to go to the infirmary because he knew that was going to be death. And it was his turn to take a real shower, and he was running hot water on it, and there was an air raid. And so the power went out. They were locked in these rooms, and he stayed in the shower, and he just kept the hot water running. And because he was in there for a long time till the hot water ran out, it cleared up, and he survived. And there were so many things they're almost surreal. I mean, one was a married couple, who the night of their wedding, someone came in and said, "You have to leave. They're coming to get all of you." And they had a quick ceremony and all of this beautiful reception that the parents had paid, and they left.
Yes.
And they went into hiding.
And somehow made it to the United States.
They did. They made it out together, but they were in hiding for 4 years. And it was interesting, the difference. There were a couple of people that I interviewed that were young, that were children. One was like 8 years old. One was closer to being a teenager. And the difference in how they responded and what happened to them and what they saw was just amazing. And years later, when we were traveling in Eastern Europe and we went to Auschwitz. And I remember thinking, it was very interesting because it was summer. And it was cold and it was raining and wet and damp and gray. And I remember turning around to my husband and saying, "It should be like this here every day." And I felt like all these thousands of people were marching behind me as I was walking through there. And, of course, I thought about all these people. And some of them I still will bump into. And it is just amazing to me what the human spirit can survive. And everybody didn't survive the same way. People who were very religious, some remained religious, some became totally non-religious. Some people have survivor's guilt. Why did they survive and not others? And, you can say to them so that you could tell this. And there were people who were told that by people that were with them. You have to survive so that you can tell the story. And so they were doing that.
Yes.
And so now it will be historical.
And I assume then that it is a collection that we probably hold here at Towson University.
I would like to think that it's still here. It should be. It should be. So I'm hoping that all of the programs that were there, I understand that Towson's doing a very good job with them. And it's very important.
It is.
And something, interestingly, when we were younger, that was not part of our history lessons.
Right.
They're in the archives.
They are in the archives.
Okay.
Well, that's good
interesting.
news.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely. We might be able to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Well, after this experience and teaching in variety of settings, both in school and with your own children and now your grandchildren, and as a fundraiser, what would your wisdom be? What would you share with individuals who are considering a teaching career themselves?
I would say I think it's one of the most rewarding things that you can do. I think it is one of the most important professions in the world. We have people that we're friendly with in Japan, And when we were there, we went to one of their houses. Doctors in Japan are thought of as teachers are revered. They are the highest paid profession. They're the ones with the bigger homes. And their school atmosphere, it's not class size. They have huge classes. Now, they do think that American students are more creative because they are, and because they're allowed to be. But I would like to see people push for higher pay, more recognition of the important role that they play. Because these people, I mean, one of my sons, I won't say which one, so we won't, although I wouldn't use a name anyway, he had a terrible first grade experience, and it broke my heart. And at that point, as a fairly young mother, I was reluctant to go and complain about it, because I didn't want to be one of those interfering mothers. You know, oh, she thinks she was a teacher, she knows everything. And it was awful. And he's a great guy, and he, quote, recovered, but I don't know if he ever completely recovered from that. It's a very important year.
It is.
And so I am acutely aware of, I just think teachers are extremely important. And when I sat at graduation this year and listened to the gentleman who went back to school as an adult to get his college and is now going to be teaching, and I thought, oh, what a wonderful, lucky group of people who will have you for a teacher. And when I listened, you know, to all the speakers, and I looked at this group of people behind me, I thought, you are so important. So just go out there, do it. It's interesting. We had, my husband and I were out to dinner a couple of weeks ago, and we had a waiter. He said something came up when he was serving something about that he was a college student, and we said, where? And he said, Towson, I'm getting ready to graduate, and I'm, you know, looking for a job. And then we had this whole 20-minute conversation.
Of course.
Because I said I had been at his graduation, because he graduated just now. And it was wonderful. I mean, to listen to him, his enthusiasm, you know, and of course, you know, being a little bit scared, is he going to get a job, and et cetera, et cetera. And I would just say to them, just keep doing what you're doing, don't give up, and push to make it more appreciated.
Yes.
You know, get all of us who are alums, you know, to organize and to, because it's so, what else could be more important? These are the people who are going to raise the children, who are going to teach the children, and partially raise them.
Oh, yes.
You know, there are teachers who have made impressions on kids who didn't even have interested parents. So sometimes those teachers are the most important people. And, you know, they're going to be teaching the future scientists and doctors and lawyers and teachers.
Absolutely.
So if you can inspire somebody else to keep this going, that
I don't know, Nadine. It sounds like there might be another job for you in this.
I don't know. But, you know, you can't, I would never say, well, I can't make a difference, because I think that collectively we can.
Of course.
And then I think that there are definitely things that need to be done to, you know, when you have a child in school, you realize how important that teacher is. And then you go about your business. And I think that more attention needs to be brought to that. You know, I think that people are being prepared even better than we were.
Well, there's more to know.
And
there are more rules and regulations to be aware of.
Well, and some of that I find very sad, because there are many times when I have been in a classroom over the last several years and thought to myself, I'd be in trouble here. Because I taught 6-year-olds, and sometimes they were upset, and I would hug them. And now you couldn't do that, or you'd be afraid to do that, because, you know, somebody's going to make something of that. So I think that's hard. You know, I do think that we have to be very careful.
Of course.
And unfortunately, sometimes it's the people that kids trust the most who have been the people that have betrayed that trust. But by and large, I think teachers are people to be respected and who really need to have that connection to these kids.
Mhm.
So
Of course.
we hope.
We hope. Is there anything that we've forgotten in our conversation that you want to share, that you can think
I
of?
don't think so. I think we've been pretty comprehensive. It's been nice to take a little bit of time to think about that time and that experience and the influence that it's had, because I do think that even without your being aware of it, that those experiences do have a tremendous effect on our lives and how we conduct ourselves and people you connect to. People that I have seen back here
Uh-huh.
for various things that I hadn't seen in a long time, that I feel connected or reconnected to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of nice, and it's interesting to see what other people did
Yes.
and the influence that they had on a lot of kids.
Well,
So
thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.